Thank you so much for being here. My name is Eddie. I am a third year PhD student at LSE. Today I'm going to talk to you about a project on data centers, which is obviously a growing literature. So let me begin with the motivation for this project, which is we understand often firms' location choices could fail to internalize externalities. The classical examples of these are when you have factory pollution or when you have local knowledge spillovers or congestion induced on traffic. The classical policy response is to use place-based policies. Now, with the growth of computation industry and the rise of modern electricity-intensive firms, I think there are two key differences that could lead us to reconsider these policies. The first difference is that externalities are now propagating through input-output supply networks. On the one hand, the cost impacts of firm locations could spread across the electricity grid, so can the environmental externalities. On the other hand, it's possible that some productivity benefits or price impacts could flow through networks of input provisions, such as the provision of computation services. The second key difference is that these firms impose both local economic and environmental externalities, but also global carbon externalities. So failing to consider one of the externalities may lead us to have a misleading assessment of the welfare impacts. So I would argue that the data centers industry is a relevant case where we should consider both local externalities and global externalities in place-based policies. On the one hand, they're among the fastest growing electricity consumers in the US, currently using almost up to 5% of electricity, with a large estimate of environmental damages from local air pollution and global carbon damages. On the other hand, we see that at different decision levels, both local externalities and global externalities are being considered when we think about how should we put where should we put data centers, or who should be supplying computation? Where should we allocate the supply of computation in order to support the growth of generative AI or other technologies that are associated with it? So at the local level, we see there's a lot of community opposition to data center establishment at the fine-grained county level, despite different states having very different policy initiatives, some offering up to 1.6 billion US dollars to incentivize data centers to locate to their own locations. On a national level, we see more considerations of grid supply and grid constraints, including some of these latest grid regulations that limit where data centers could be based on the balance of supply and demand. So I'm going to pause here if there's no questions.
Is there any chance that this way of doing AI will change and become less energy intensive? Some new technology comes along that doesn't require such vast quantity of electricity?
That's a great point. So over the past 10 years, there have been large energy efficiency improvements in the data center industry. But if you look at the recent 5 years, the energy efficiency improvement has stalled. So it's possible that in the future, this will become less of a problem. There's also a carbon-water trade-off, which is as data centers become less water intensive, if they're using less water intensive cooling, they will become more energy intensive. So you kind of have to choose between, in some sense, you have to choose between water footprints and carbon footprints. Yes.
You're saying that input-output structure is important to think about when thinking of these data centers. What are you thinking of exactly? Is it just congestion through the electricity markets, or do you think of other input-output stuff? Oh, that's just it. Yeah.
So in this project, I'm trying to model the benefits and how it flows through space, using the idea that you can buy computation from anywhere, but the quality of computation is degrading based on telecommunications network or latency networks. So if you think about having access to lower latency computation services may benefit some firms, particularly those that use computation a lot. That's how the benefits would flow through space. Yes.
Is there any externalities specific to data centers? Because it looks like all the externalities you mentioned come from power plants, not from data centers.
So they could generate local externalities if you think about potential impacts on local water stress or visual noise or just noise pollution in general. That could set them apart from power plants, but also they're also potentially similar to other electricity intensive firms, which mean this framework in principle could be applied to other settings. Okay, I'm just going to charge ahead. So in this project, I'm going to try the big question that I'm hoping to ask eventually is, what is the socially optimal spatial allocations of data centers once we account for the local environmental impacts, economic impacts, as well as their impacts on global carbon externalities? The approach that I'm going to be doing is I'm going to develop a quantitative spatial model featuring location choices of data centers and how they interact with the rest of the agents in the economy. disciplining the model using sort of three types of evidence. On the one hand, I'm going to proxy firms' demand for data center services across space. And then I'm going to use or estimate the sector-specific labor market impacts of data center industry. Finally, I'm going to look at sort of proxying or trying to estimate the amenity spillovers at the local level when a data center enters. And the main counterfactuals that I'm sort of considering will be applying to an existing policy instrument that has been quite prevalent in the US, which is the state level large tax incentives or tax reductions. And I'm basically trying to ask, if we remove the existing state level tax incentives, what would be the counterfactual spatial distribution of data centers? Could this lead to aggregate welfare gain? And what would be the distribution of welfare gains or losses across space? Like who would benefit and who would lose? Okay, so I'm sort of quickly going to sort of jump through the contributions to the literature because this is indeed a very fast growing literature. So I think I'm sort of building on the literature on quantitative spatial models with environmental externalities. And my contribution is to embed the data center sector as a partially tradable service with sort of different types of externalities. On the place-based policies literature, my sort of potential contribution is to consider policies when externalities are propagating across different types of more than one network. Finally, on the sort of the literature on the economics and environmental impacts of data centers, my contribution is to sort of build a quantitative model to account for the general equilibrium spillovers of these computation firms, as well as to really think about not the welfare impacts of a data center per se, but the welfare impacts of policies regulating the industry under different possible scenarios. Okay, so I'm going to sort of tell you a little bit about the types of data that I'm using for this project. So first and foremost, I'm going to be using a comprehensive facility level data set on data centers across the US, both operational and under construction from different sources. Importantly, this will allow me to observe for each of the over 3,000 facilities in the data set when they become operational, what is their installed power capacity. On the labor markets front, I'm just going to assemble a county by year level panel data set of wages, establishments, and employment outcomes. Someone might ask, why are you studying counties? Why are you not using a more fine-grained spatial resolution? It's a great question. I'm sort of, for now, deciding on counties, but I've sort of done some analysis using a different level of spatial resolution. And I think more is mostly a data tractability issue, but I think it's also possible to do the analysis at other levels. On the electricity markets level, I'm going to assemble a panel data set also at the county by year level using sort of matching between utilities and counties to construct the average electricity cost, generation capacity. I guess sort of what's more interesting is to measure, if you are a firm, what determine your choices of data centers and what determine the quality of computation services that you will receive. To this end, I will be using sort of point-to-point latency pair test data that measure the amount of delay of sending data services from one location to the other location supplied by a service firm that has around 276 different sort of origin destination pairs across 103 cities over 10 years. I'm also going to assemble a data set collected by the Department of Energy that tells me across the US, what are the different geographic suitabilities of hosting a data centers, which are measured based on things like proximity to substations, proximity to existing high-speed fiber networks. And finally, I sort of assembled a data set that tells me at a given year and a given state, what is the generosity of the tax incentives used to incentivize data centers. Yes.
On the carbon side, just given where it is, do you see anything about, or can you estimate anything about the impacts on carbon markets? I'm just thinking about the Virginia case, which, as I understand it, has sort of fundamentally affected the functioning of RGGI because the whole regional carbon market that's been thrown by the volumes there, and whether you can account for that in thinking about the carbon externality. It might be that the share covered by the East or the Californian carbon markets is small enough, but I would expect they'd be very concentrated there, and it's going to matter on the implications for the carbon externalities at least.
Yeah, for sure. So what the model does is it does tell me for any spatial configuration of data centers, what sort of the aggregate impact of this industry on the carbon emissions. So what I could do is sort of—
which of those are covered by carbon markets?
So what I could do is to try and sort of find data on this and then to examine sort of if there's some counterfactual policy scenarios where you use this policy instrument, to what extent can it already offset the impacts by potentially changing location choices? Can I answer that question? Yeah.
Yeah, I think as I understand it, the Virginia data center cluster has changed the structure of the functioning of the RGGI market because it's so important.
I see. Yeah.
So I think it would just be useful to have some sort of back of the envelope quantification of what share or whether it may be that you can shut it down because it's small enough, but I think it's probably worth thinking about if the carbon externalities are going to turn out to be first order.
Yes, okay, for sure. Thank you. Yes.
Are you able to distinguish between the different types of data centers, like between co-locations or hyperscalers, for example, over time? Because I mean, after 2010, there was like a big shift in the construction.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do observe that firms affiliated with the facility. So I do, in the analysis for now, I'm sort of not making a distinction between co-location and hyperscale. This is an ongoing extension that's going to sort of be done. But I think on the impacts bit, what I do find is that the labor market impacts in terms of total employment are different two types of facilities are not very different qualitatively. So it seems like there is a sort of heterogeneity driven by the size, but not by the type of facility that's entering into a county.
Do they hire a lot? I was just curious because you focus on this labor market, but because my prior is not like these firms hire a lot of people because their data centers, all things are automatic.
So I think that's the right sort of, the direct employment footprint according to industry statement is low, like 100 megawatt data center employs around 12 people. But what I'm finding is there is an employment response that's largely driven by industries outside of the computation or ICT sector. So suggesting sort of other firms are responding to their entry. Okay. Finally, I'm going to quickly talk about sort of this measure that I'm building to tell me what is the market share of firms using data storage services. So I'm going to use a multi-vantage point measurement campaign to identify what is the city of the data center that a firm headquartered in a given city is using, and I'm going to use that to discipline some of these demand estimates. Okay, so I'm going to show you some empirics before moving to the model. So this is the spatial distribution of data centers in 2005. You have some clusters around both the East Coast and the West Coast. And this is their spatial distribution in 2025. There's been a lot of expansion in existing cluster and the formation of new clusters. So the next thing I'm going to show you is a set of sort of event studies that exploit precisely the spatial variation in where they enter to look at their labor market impacts, taking very seriously the idea that their entry may be endogenous. So I'm going to sort of, to this end, I have a set of robustness checks that I won't go into today, but I'm just going to show you sort of the simplest event studies that just says what happened to a given county's labor market outcomes after a data center arrives in the county. Before that, the spatial configuration corresponds closely to the spatial distribution of state tax incentives. And in my own estimates, I do find that state tax incentives are a very quantitatively important driver in determining their location choices. Okay, so now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the empirical estimates of the local impacts of data centers on labor markets. So the first finding is that I find that after the first data center entry into the county, I see a significant increase in total employment. There is some sort of evidence that the level of employment prior to the entry of data centers was higher in these counties. Most of these effects are indeed driven by the service sectors. If you look at sort of what's happening to the manufacturing sector, what I see is that we find a significant reduction in the number of manufacturing establishments and sort of an imprecisely estimated impact on manufacturing employment from, suggesting sort of the employment expansion is quite sector specific.
So what is total employment?
Total employment is manufacturing plus services.
Yeah, but what's the net effect?
So the net effect is on the left. So the net effect on employment is positive, mostly driven by the service sectors.
So the unit of observation is the county, right? How do you account for like multiple data centers entering over time? Because it's like they aggregate a lot, right?
So I have a set of checks where I exclude the specific shocks where you have a wave of data centers. And I also look at the impacts of the second and the third entry. The impacts are smaller, but the aggregate sign of the effects of the third or the second entry is still positive.
Right.
Okay, great. So the next thing I'm going to sort of show you is in terms of sort of which sectors do we really see labor market impacts? We see primarily an impact on employment for high computation services. So I'm showing you 3 industries where, according to the BEA input-output table, are on the top tercile of this sort of input share of computation, suggesting these are the industries that buy a lot of computation. We see a positive employment response in each of these industries. These employment responses tend to be a little bit lagged. And I guess, interestingly, on the employment front, we don't see the largest impact on employment coming from the information sector. You would expect that if all of the employment is just driven by the data centers, it would show up in construction and information sector. Instead, what we're seeing is that firms that are not directly employable by the data centers are employing more workers. Yes.
I guess one concern might be reverse causation, that these are industries that are about to boom in those locations and therefore you need a data center to support them. So I wonder whether you can construct an instrument based on like the grade of fiber optic or something that predicts where data centers will be.
Yeah, that's a great point. So in one of the robustness checks, I'm using the interactions between state tax incentives and cross-sectional county suitability of data center. Of data center to predict their entry. And I find similar effects on service entry and aggregate employment effects, or like local employment effects. Thanks. Yes.
They could also be correlated shocks, right? That the same company is opening a data center and something else at the same time.
Yeah, so sort of partly addressing that, I'm controlling for state or fixed effects, which sort of, if you will control for some of these other state-specific policy shocks. But there could be other things that I could be doing. Completely agree. Okay, I'm going to sort of quickly move to the last empirical result before trying to show you some results from the model. So the last finding that I have is that at the county level, I actually find that data center entry increases net migration. This is driven by both increase in migration and increase out migration, but the effects on total in migration dominates the effects on out migration. So it seems like some people are leaving the counties that are hosting data centers, but more people are flowing in, resulting in a positive impact on total migration flow. I'm going to use this to discipline my parameter of the amenity impacts of data centers. So the idea is that if controlling for real wages, we still see people flocking into data centers counties after they open, this is sort of taken as evidence that they're increasing amenities, these unobserved determinants of location attractiveness. Okay, so the magnitude of the effect is, it's around, so this is migration rate, which is number of people moving divided by the stock. So this is about like 0.8%, which is not a quantitatively large impact. If you estimate the amenity spillover, it's about 1.016. So it's like 1.6% improvement in amenities from increasing data center capacity.
It could be a large impact. Like you might want to figure out for next presentation what the base rate is. Like I could imagine 0.8% is huge relative to how many people usually move.
Okay, yeah, I could do like a count model, or I could do something that.
Or I'm just saying you might want to know the base rate of migration. If it's like 3% of people move, 0.8% impact could be like huge relative to that, right?
Okay, yeah, should look into that. Thank you. Yes.
This is great. So these are results from the labor market side. Do we see results on the poultry side or carbon side?
I'm going to sort of use the model to tell me that today. I have some results on electricity tariffs and local air pollution that I'm not sort of going to show you. What I do see is sort of some evidence of indeed a reduction in air pollution instead of an increase in air pollution, suggestive of some sort of like manufacturing displacing, outweighing the impacts of increased generation. Okay, great. So I'm going to sort of now.
Is water the other big one?
Yes. So I don't have evidence on water yet, but it's going to be one channel that I aim to incorporate. Okay. Thank you. All right. So now I'm going to show you the model. Before the model in math, I'm going to sort of show you some schematics that tell you how do I think data centers affect other agents in the economy. We know that they're big buyers of electricity. They could crowd out electricity intensive firms. Through the pollution dispersal model that I will have, it will change the spatial distribution of pollution concentration and therefore pollution damages across space. On the other hand, the availability of cheaper compute or the increased quality of compute could also affect tradable firms, could also affect service firms, particularly those in the computation intensive sectors. How this all affects welfare of workers in the end, on the one hand, it could affect workers' welfare through real wages, including the labor market outcomes as well as the electricity prices. On the other hand, it could be affecting amenities and the tax revenues that the workers have to pay or the tax revenues that the government will receive. So I'm going to set up the model by assuming that the households can choose where to live and they can choose which of the 4 sectors to work in. So there's going to be a tradable manufacturing sector, a low computation service sectors, think of them as utilities repair, electricity repair, other sort of manual services, and I'm going to have a high computation services sector mapping into those event studies that I showed you. The worker is allowed to be unemployed with an outside option that's equal to county mean wage. There's going to be costly migration across counties and across sectors, leading to this standard first shade distribution telling us where they will move or the average expected migration share. Importantly, worker utility is going to receive a proportional reduction from environmental damages. So thinking about the idea that, when you have a data center, depending on which power plants respond to electricity demand, you will have differences in pollution and differences in welfare. How do I compute total damage? I'm going to take the county that the data center is in, compute the total increase in electricity demand, and then I'm going to map it into one of the six NERC regions. So the idea is that electricity is partially tradable up to a given NERC region. So any one of the power plants within the region could respond. I'm going to empirically estimate the policy response functions of these power plant generations that tell me, I'm using sort of the past 5 years of data that tell me, when you have an increased load in one of the regions, who are the power plants who respond? And how much will each of the power plants generations increase in order to meet that electricity demand? And finally, because I know where the power plants are, I know how much they generate based on the prediction model, I can use the AP3 pollution dispersal model to exactly tell me where will the increase in pollution be distributed, or how will it be distributed. So this is all a little bit sort of complicated, but just to give you sort of an example, this is the per worker local damage monetized in 2024 dollars. If I just compute the model, I don't know exactly where Phoenix is. I think it's around here. But if you see adding a 100 megawatt data center in Phoenix, this is the spatial distribution of local damages that is being sort of experienced across the country. You see sort of the standard properties of pollution dispersal model at work. Okay, and if you sort of look cross-sectionally across different counties, the distribution of environmental damages, only focusing on local pollution, actually has a wide distribution across different potential data center hubs. So suggesting that there could be some sort of gain in terms of local air pollution if you move them into different places. And finally, as I was the next step is to sort of model the amenity spillovers of data centers. And I was sort of already talking to you that I am disciplining the estimates of amenity spillovers using the net impacts of migration responses. So I'm sort of assuming that amenities is a function of local baseline amenities and is going to be an increasing and concave function of the data center capacity that the location receives. So the idea is sort of like, if you see people moving in despite lower real wages or despite higher prices, that's sort of taken as evidence that there is some amenity gain in other ways that we're not capturing. Okay, I have 8 minutes. I'm going to this will be the last 2 slides that I show you on the model, and then I'm going to sort of talk about the counterfactuals. But on the production side, I am thinking, because I already told you that I will have sort of 3 different sectors. I have this tradable manufacturing sector that only use labor and electricity. So think of them as manufacturing plants who don't use a lot of computation. I'm going to have 2 service sectors. The only difference between them will just be the computation intensity measure. So I'm going to assume that for services like professional services, they use more computation than manual services. Importantly, for each of the sectors, I am assuming monopolistic competition structure with a fixed entry cost, leading to this sort of familiar constant markup pricing rule. On the productivity on the productivity front, I'm just going to assume the standard sort of agglomeration or externality from labor, calibrating the strength of the agglomeration or externality using a standard parameter. One possible extension, obviously, is to try and estimate and include this local sector specific productivity impact of data center. So that's one of the things that I'm already trying to do. On the electricity sector front, I'm going to assume that because electricity is tradable, partially tradable across base, the level of market clearing for electricity will be one of the 41 balancing authorities in my data. So for each of these balancing authorities, I am assuming you have fixed generation capital. You have this sort of very simplified Cobb-Douglas production function of electricity. This is a simplification, but I think to the extent that it fits the data, okay, I think this is sort of the current iteration. Obviously, there's scope to sort of embed the model into the pollution dispatch model as well. Okay, so the important thing is really about how the data center produces computation services and what determine their location choices. I'm just going to assume that data centers use a combination of labor and electricity. They employ very few workers, but they use a lot of electricity. As I was saying, a standard 100 megawatt data center only uses 12 workers. And the per unit electricity consumption of a data center in each of the counties is going to be predicted from local climate and cooling. So I use the local climate prediction model to tell me for each unit of megawatt of power capacity, how much energy, how much electricity is used for cooling, so that all the variation in the model is actually driven by these climate variation rather than sort of endogenous choices of data centers to have different power energy efficiency. I'm going to assume that data center operators will be competing via a monopolistic competition structure with some quality decay, leading to them paying a fixed markup over, or the prices that they will be charging will be a fixed markup over the marginal cost. And the marginal cost will just be wages plus electricity times the per unit sort of efficiency of a given data center across base. So I promised the last slide on the math before we go into the counterfactual. How do firms really purchase computation? I'm assuming if you're a service firm in anywhere in the country, you can buy computation in any other county, but there is going to be quality degradation. The quality degradation is governed by these five parameters, which are bilateral network quality. I'm going to empirically estimate the bilateral network quality using the latency data that I have. But the idea is that if I'm a firm here, I could buy a data center service there, but then that's going to be farther, so there's going to be sort of a lower quality relative to me buying from a nearby location. And the degree of substitutability between these providers will be determined by the elasticity of substitution, which I empirically estimate using the demand data. Yes.
For a firm, can they actually choose like where your service is coming from? Is that a real mistake?
So there are two types of sort of computation services. One is you choose a virtual machine. If you go to Amazon Web Service, it allows you to choose which region. If you're a service firm who uses a lot of computation, you have to choose which co-location data center you rank space in. So it's true that you choose where.
Thank you.
Okay.
So how bad is the kind of degradation over space? I mean, is it a significant degradation if I buy it from Arizona, I'm in New York, versus buying it in New York?
So the degradation, the latency ranges from somewhere like 4 milliseconds to something like 64 milliseconds. So you could think that the degree to which this matters depends on the sectors. So I'm sort of saying that it matters for the high computation services more relative to the low computation services. That's sort of just how I've sort of modeled this so far. Okay. Cost minimization of these computation service firms will lead to this gravity-based expenditure of how much they buy from data center providers in a given city. This is going to be increasing in prices and sort of decreasing in the computation quality of the destination data center provider. So finally, sort of data centers are going to choose where to enter by first computing the variable profits of entering in a given location before drawing a profit shock. The dispersion parameter of the profit shock is another key parameter that I just empirically estimate from the data using the entry responses of data centers to tax incentives. Okay, so finally, I can show you some of the counterfactual results that I have so far. So based on a model, what I do is sort of, I take the baseline equilibrium, which is sort of the spatial distribution of economic activities in 2024. I assume that all of the planned expansion of data centers will come online. And then I first quantify the welfare effects of this business as usual scenario, which is what happened when just a lot of data centers come online. And then I assume that what if we're in a world where there's no state tax incentives, where different states are not competing to subsidize data centers across space. I predict the spatial distribution of data centers under the no tax counterfactual. And then I compute the welfare level of that counterfactual equilibrium. So what I'm showing you is sort of the welfare change from moving from the business as usual expansion equilibrium to this counterfactual no tax equilibrium. Any questions before I just show you that?
Sorry if you have missed this, but there's no endogenous response to the grid.
Yes, so I'm shutting down, I'm assuming power generation capacity is fixed. So,
but I mean, even within, what share are the big, I don't know, as I understand it, Amazon and Google or whatever?
Yeah.
The data center investments are accompanied by a commitment to build a huge solar installation or buy a bunch of offsets or whatever to change. That's not, and maybe they're a tiny share, I don't know, but the grid or the portfolio of renewable contributions or whatever is fixed here. That doesn't respond to the amount that is in a given location.
So the local damage functions are a function of excess load, which is sort of non-dispatchable load. So what I could do is I could compute the changes in renewables, assuming that they're all they're all committing to really build them. And then I could compute the counterfactual when I incorporate the additional distribution of solar capacity.
But here you just
here I'm not.
Okay.
Yeah, so you should sort of consider this as potentially, I might be sort of overestimating environmental impacts if they're somehow able to do it to offset some of these impacts. Okay. So I have
similarly, I mean, maybe Amazon's a bad example. Similarly, states, presumably with tax incentives, that might be accompanied by renewable credits. I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, I can think about it. Yes, thank you. So, okay, in the final last minute I will show you is, okay, so what happens in this counterfactual no tax equilibrium? First of all, these are where the data centers are proposed to be built. And this is where they will be, this is where the model will tell me they will go in the absence of tax incentives. The model will tell me in the absence of tax incentives, they're going to move away from some of the existing sort of big clusters of activity, especially towards the Western United States. You might be asking, is the model doing an okay job? I used the model in 2024 to predict the spatial distribution of plant facilities, and the correlation is around 0.5. So I think it's sort of doing an okay job of predicting where these plant facilities were going to be under the same vector of state tax incentives. So the key takeaway here is that the model tells me that state tax incentives are quite important in determining location choices, and data centers will move away in the absence of tax incentives. Finally, final graph or final sort of table. What is the aggregate welfare effects of moving to this no tax equilibrium? In aggregate, I find that it's going to sort of increase national welfare by a small amount by the fraction of baseline welfare, and it's going to increase welfare by around 1.94 billion. There's going to be a lot of sort of distributional differences. The counties that were hosting data centers are seeing most of the welfare gain. The counties that are not hosting data centers are actually seeing a welfare loss from removing tax incentives. If you just look at the carbon impacts, this is from the pollution dispatch model, it's telling me that removing tax incentives induce data centers to actually move to locations with cleaner grid, and this will reduce the total carbon emissions of the data center industry by around 56.5 million megatons, which is around 3.7% of total electricity emissions today. So it seems to be sort of quantitatively important on the carbon side, and there's some local responses. Okay, I'm out of time, so I'm going to sort of quickly conclude, but thank you so much for your comments, and I'm really happy to chat about anything if you have other questions.